Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tuesdays with BOA. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs at Writers and Books. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. You can check out our upcoming schedule at wae.org. We're so happy to partner with BOA Editions tonight to bring you Mark Polanzak. First, we'll hear Mark read, and then he'll be in conversation with BOA publisher and executive director, Peter Connors. Feel free to submit questions to the Q&A function. Mark's book is available through our bookstore, Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. The winner of the BOA Short Fiction Prize, the OK End of Funnytown, excavates the layers between our collective obsession with passing fads and our secret yearning for lasting connection. As writer Laura Vandenberg says, it's packed with fantastic worlds, rich with menace and wonder and high-wire feats of voice. Here you'll find mimes, robots, clones, summer camps designed to help adults recover their lost childhoods, and sharply funny insights into the human condition. Mark Polanzak is the author of the hybrid fiction memoir Pop. His stories have appeared in the Southern Review, the American Scholar, and Best American Non-Required Reading 2017. He is a founding editor of Draft, the Journal of Process, and a contributor to the podcast, The Failsafe. He teaches writing and literature at Berklee College of Music in Boston. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Dan, for having me, and thanks to Writers and Books. Thanks to Peter Connors for doing the talk that we'll get to in a minute. Yeah, great. I'm going to read two stories. They're short. So if you've ever heard me read before, the chances are very good that you've heard this first story that I'm going to read, which is called Giant. The second story I'm going to read is called Used Goods. I read that less often. And if you've heard everything that I've read and you've read my collection in its entirety, there is still something new for you to hear tonight because I'm going to read something that's not published. At the very end, after the talk, I'll read a little micro fiction, which is called My Tour of Lies. And I'm excited to read it because not many people have heard it. So it'll be exciting to put it out in the world in some form. So thanks for coming. Those of you who are here, I can't see anybody, but I trust that you're out there and as excited as I am. So I'll just get to it. This story is called Giant. And here we go. Oh, sorry, one last thing. I have poor vision, so I'm going to read this very closely. So if you see me leaning in, just don't worry. You could just stare off and just imagine the images as they come. Okay, story is called Giant. The surprisingly few eyewitness reports stated that the giant walked, more or less, up Main Street from the west, stepping on the pavement and sometimes in patches of trees and parks and backyards, just before dawn. He stopped in the square, choosing to sit in the brick courtyard of the city hall and leaned back against the big stone church, blocking off traffic on Elm and Putnam. Authorities discovered that he had successfully avoided stomping on parked cars and most of the city's infrastructure, but that many swing sets, water fountains, jungle gyms, basketball hoops, grills, and gardens had been smushed. No one knew if any birds or squirrels, likely sleeping in the parks and backyards, had been flattened. The giant was still sitting in the square in the morning, a crisp and blue Monday morning in September. We found police cruisers and fire trucks parked with lights flashing in a 2-block radius of the giant. Residents of the buildings within the zone were evacuated, businesses were cleared and shuttered. There wasn't a TV or radio station broadcasting anything but news of the giant. Live footage from the helicopter aired endlessly. The giant was taller than the city hall, the stone church, and the apartment buildings, even while sitting. Few of us saw him erect. He wore baggy, tattered brown pants drawn by a red rope, an ill-fitting faded green shirt, and no shoes. He was human, He had human feet, human hands. A brown satchel was strapped around his torso. He occasionally reached into the satchel to remove handfuls of giant berries and something else that crunched and echoed throughout town. He had long, stringy blonde hair that fell on either side of his face, down to his shoulders, except in back, where a few strands had been pulled and tied up with a giant red band. No one had heard him speak. No one, as far as we knew, had attempted to communicate. Since the giant seemed to have purposely avoided crushing our homes and cars and had made no indication that he wanted to hurt us, we did not panic. Even the flashing lights and sirens did not inspire anxiety. The newscasts were not fear-driven. The reporters were curious. It wasn't an emergency to anyone. It was awe-striking. Eventually, the sirens were silenced. The flashes were shut off. You could hear laughter in the streets. When he reached for more food, there were gasps of joy. Children were held on shoulders to have a look. The mayor, around 3 o'clock that first day, was raised up on a cherry picker and handed a megaphone. He said to the giant, "Hello." The whole town was silent, awaiting a response. When, after a minute had passed and the giant had reached for another handful of food, the mayor repeated himself, adding his name, title, the name of our city, and a welcome message. To our great delight, the giant finally acknowledged the mayor, turning to him and emanating a ground-shaking 3-syllable reply. But we could not understand. He was not an English speaker. Professors from the language department of the university listened to the recording, determining that it was not something that they had ever heard before. Linguistic anthropologists then went to work on the recording. They were not sure either. Verbal communication was placed on hold. None of us went to work that first day. No child went to school. Many of us chuckled after remarking that the giant had put things in perspective. Our work seemed small. Our school seemed small. The giant was all we cared about, and no one disputed it. How could we get our paperwork done with the giant down the street? How could any teacher concentrate on her lesson? There was no way our kids were going to do math problems with a real, live giant outside. The influx of reporters and visitors slammed our streets and hotels and bars and restaurants that first night. You could talk with the person seated next to you. There wasn't a chance they'd be discussing anything else. You could talk with anyone on the street. What do you do in a situation like this? He doesn't want to hurt us. He can't talk with us. He just looks tired, don't you think? He keeps sighing and eating. Have you seen that he fell asleep? He sleeps with his head resting on the post office. Did you hear him snore? It sounded like low rolling thunder. Yeah, it was soothing. And now, in how he scoops gallons of water from the river with his hand? Although the mayor had spoken with him, no one had attempted to touch him until the third day. After town meetings to devise the best plan to approach the giant, it was decided that the mayor and 30 policemen would carry flags with every conceivable peaceful symbol drawn on them. A peace sign, a pure white flag, 2 hands shaking, the word love, the word welcome, pictures of people waving and smiling, big flags, big signs. They would walk cautiously up to the giant. We decided to make an offering, a barrel of orange juice, a loaf of bread the size of a school bus. We would place these before him and back away, waiting for him to notice that we were being kind. Then the mayor and policemen would walk closer and closer, extending their hands and shaking each other's hands to demonstrate what we meant. Everything went as planned. But the giant never reached down to touch anyone. When the mayor got close enough, he touched the giant's heel. The giant did not notice. This was frustrating. He ate the bread in a single chomp. He tossed the barrel of OJ into his mouth, crunched, and swallowed. He went back to sighing, wiping his brow and resting. The giant is not interested in us. He is not curious about us in the slightest. He eats, drinks, rests, sighs, and sleeps. He has made no attempt to look any of us, save for the mayor that first day, in the eye. He has not thanked us for the food. He has not apologized for trampling our parks and gardens and recreation areas. He has not offered any help of any kind. Not long ago, we began to wonder why we were so curious. What, apart from his obvious size, made him any more interesting than any of us? Why were we constantly talking about him for days and weeks on end? Why were we fascinated every time he reached for his satchel or scratched his forearm? We all still talked to each other, but the conversation turned. We had waited long enough. We wanted to know if anything was going to happen, or if we were just going to have to live with a giant in our square, a dumb oaf that caused people to move out of their homes, that caused the government to move the offices of City Hall and the post office to other buildings. If he were of normal size, he would be completely uninteresting. He would be mentally deficient, mangy. We would pity him. He contributed nothing. He took, he stole, he trespassed, he destroyed, he frustrated and incensed. He was boring. When we travel, when we mention where we live and people ask, isn't that the town with the giant? We sigh, yes. When we return home, we ask if it is still there. And our neighbors give the sarcastic answer, oh, it wouldn't go anywhere. Don't you worry. When we walk to the bus stop, we glance up at him with as much amazement as we do down to our watches. We know what we'd see. We would see a giant sitting there, eating and drinking. We'd see a tired monster, not interesting enough to even hurt us. We'd see him wipe his brow, then we'd check the time. That's the end of the story, Giant. I'm gonna take a sip of water. And now I have a second story. Let me shake off giant vibes. And this is the last story in the collection. So I'm reading the first story and the last story. So if you haven't read the book, you don't need to. That is the beginning and the end. You have the entire arc of it. I'm kidding, it's a collection of stories. So this is a story called Used Goods. And here we go. I needed a lot more than what I had managed to cram in the back of my Subaru for the move. It was a hasty job, which wasn't philosophically conceived. I simply hadn't thought the move through enough. But I recast my anxiety about leaving things behind into a dream of starting over. I took my clothes, some books, a few lamps, my computer and guitar, but I left almost everything else on the curb with a sign reading, "It's all yours now." Right across the street from my new apartment, there was a used goods store. Perfect, I thought. What do I need? I made a quick list, and I promised myself I would only get what I wrote down. I was only going to get what I needed this time. No more clutter. Bed frame, work desk, chairs, kitchen table, pots and pans. Bare essentials, a clean slate. But you never know what you need until you are faced with all the things you want. Nearly everything on my list was in the first room of the store. So I told the people working there that I would be buying these things and coming back periodically to cart them away. Then, like a fool, I browsed. I've always liked secondhand stores, antiques warehouses, thrift shops, the kinds of places where you could find a gleaming set of silverware in a mahogany box for hundreds of dollars on the same shelf as a tape deck missing the rewind button. You might find a bargain, or an item no longer being manufactured, or a toy that you had misplaced years and years ago, a lifetime ago. The toy could be the very one you played with. It had its own lifespan, just like you. And here you two are, coinciding again. I always enjoyed that items had other people's stories and lives imbued in them. Someone may have used the desks a century ago to write unrequited love letters by candlelight. I try not to get too carried away, but I wonder and hope sometimes that something lives in the material. I pushed through a beaded curtain into a second room that housed cardboard boxes of VHS and cassette tapes, VCRs and radios, standing lamps, nightstands. Actually, I needed a nightstand and I forgot to jot it down. Shelves upon shelves of old novels, glassware, cookware, paintings, armchairs, jewelry and glass display cases, magnifying glasses, large standing brass ashtrays, rotary phones, vinyl records, and dusty turntables. Some alluring nostalgia, useful, but mostly unnecessary. The third room, which lay behind a heavy oak door, contained much the same as the first, but these particular items on closer inspection were damaged. A desk missing a drawer, an upright piano with only black keys. I suppose one could take this stuff home and fix it, but I am no good at repairing anything. Better to move on. I creaked open a beat up screen door to enter the final room, which looked just like an old general store. Aisles stacked with cereal boxes and soup cans, refrigerators lined with liters of milk, bottles of juice, cans of soda, cartons of eggs, frosted brown bottles of beer and six-packs. I deserved it, I thought, and pulled open the glass door. Refreshing icy breath escaped the cooler. When I grabbed and lifted the six-pack, I tumbled backward. It was incredibly light. The bottles were empty, caps sealed to the tops. I held a bottle up to the light. Empty. I replaced the pack and grabbed another. Light as the first. It felt good to hold the six-pack of empty bottles. It felt manageable. I felt a touch stronger, a bit more capable. I carried it around the store, thinking I would inform the cashier of the beer problem when I was finished shopping. On the other side of the registers were long tables with board games laid out, a Scrabble board with words on it, a completed game, stretch, perpendicular to higher, perpendicular to exit. A notebook rested next to the game. Initials were scrawled across the top, the scores written down in columns. JM had beaten out WM and RP by 20 points. 2 tiles lay in the tiny wooden rack on one side of the table, on one side of the board, and 1 tile lay in the rack facing me. An M, 3 points subtracted from WM's score. I put the notebook in my pocket and gingerly picked up the Scrabble board, balancing the game on my palm like a waiter. At the impulse buy section at the counter, I saw mason jars of Bic pens without caps, blues, blacks, 1 red. There were yellow stick-it pads covered with words, to do, laundry, groceries, oil change. Some words were scratched out. I placed the 6-pack on the counter and withdrew a blue pen. I tried crossing off laundry because I had actually done it, but the pen was inkless. The old man in line in front of me paid for a pack of cigarettes, opened it, and tapped out a crumpled filter into his palm. I bought the 6-pack, Scrabble game, yellow stick-it pad, and 2 pens. I told the cashier that I would come back for all the furniture as soon as I made some friends to help me with it. When I came home to my new place, satisfied that I had only got what I needed, with just a few small gifts to myself, I put the finished Scrabble game in the middle of the living room floor, tossed the 6-pack in the fridge, and began reading over a to-do list with a dry pen in my hand. At some point, I cracked an empty beer and looked out the window, thinking that I was maybe going to make it this time in this new place. Then there was a knock on the door, but whoever it was, they were already leaving. And that is the end of that story. Thank you. I hear your applause coming through cyberspace. Feels really good.
That's fantastic.
So the reading portion is over, except for the unpublished story that I will read at the very end of this. So hang out for the unpublished story.
It was so great to hear you read those. I've, obviously read them many, many times on the page, but I've never heard your voice with them. So that was a real treat. It occurred to me, and we talked about this a little before we started, that you are the first fiction writer on Tuesdays with BOA. It has been all poets. And so I had like a snarky first question, which was like, why is fiction better than poetry? And but I'm not gonna ask that. But that'll be lurking in the background. I do have a question, though. I mean, I think all writers start with a love of language, and then it just finds its way into whatever form they pursue. And so I am curious why, short stories, why fiction as opposed to poetry or journalism or memoir or something like that?
That's a great question. And I've thought about this several times and never figured it out. So let me try to do it on the spot, or rehash all of the ways that I've sort of conceived of this. I do think that, to answer your first question that was snarky, I do think that fiction, that prose fiction, that short stories and novels are, for me, the greatest experience in literature or in arts. Like, I love so many different things, and I've tried many of them out. And there was one form, and it was fiction prose, that I felt a little bit more at home with. I wasn't good at it to start off with. I wasn't good at none of these things, like painting, drawing, poetry, theater, fiction writing. But I felt a little bit more like I was in control of my own personal failures with it, and I could improve on them. I've also just had the experience, and I think that probably, I don't understand how this could be there could be any other way that this is true. But the experiences that I've had of art that are most profound are with short stories and with novels. And if they were with poetry, I would probably be trying to do poetry, even if I was no good at it. I would not be trying to do fiction if I were somehow had more aptitude for it. I'm just going for the thing that has touched me the most and been the most profound. Also, it seemed like something that was accessible to me. And the more and more you sort of start to do this thing, your life takes on a little bit of a representation of it. And I do consider the way that I live and the way that I write a little bit melded at this point. And I don't think in poems, I think in what is the story? What's like the tension? What is the thing that is going on here that I could tell the story around? Like, how do we describe this place and this person? And that I just know that I just should keep on doing this one instead of the others. And it's been a long haul since, like 8th grade when I started to experiment with all this stuff.
I'm curious, a lot of times we talk about influences on somebody's writing, but your answer puts me in mind of a different question, which is like, what is the writer or, maybe even a specific story or book that hooked you? And I'm thinking in terms of like that first love that maybe it's not even the influence on your writing now, but that sort of just hooked you into the fascination of writing and creating in that way.
Well, I think I was like dropped in the water. And then I saw the lure, then I was hooked, and then I was like taken onto the boat and then gutted. So there's like several stages of this happening. And I know that stage number 1 was like my dad reading to me and like reading me stories. And then when I found my first book that made me want to skip recess outside in like 4th grade, when I was like told my friends, like, I'm actually just going to sit here and finish James and the Giant Peach instead of play kickball today. I was like, there's something awesome going on here. And then as you mature, there was there was a story called Rain by Stephen Milhauser. It was the first story I read by Stephen Milhauser. Mm-hmm. And I was maybe 18 years old. And I knew that he was teaching at Skidmore College where I was going. So I checked out the story, and it was one of the shortest stories in the collection, the Barnum Museum. So I was like, oh, I'll read the shortest one. What is this guy about? Should I take a class with him? And I was reading Rain, and it's a pretty basic story, like about this guy who's going to a movie theater and then coming out and there's a rainstorm. And I was like, okay. And he goes along, and there's some nice descriptions, and it was great. And at the very end of the story, spoiler alert, the guy gets washed away by water and becomes just like a puddle of color and disappears. And I put the story down, and I had never known that was possible. And I think that that's something that unlocks for anybody who's trying to do something, when they find something where they feel like rules were broken in a way that unlocks a new territory. For me, that happened when I was like 18. as I continue on, I think that I can read Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson once a year and re-fall in love with language every single time. And he's a poet turned fiction writer, and his concentration on language, on the word, on the sentence, on the way everything sounds and comes together just makes me think that, you know, there is, every single time I read it, you know, a reaffirmation that this is where I gotta be.
Agreed completely. Yeah, that is an amazing book. And I'm as soon as you said James and the Giant Peach, I thought how interesting that you just read Giant, and not even the title, but being this concept of this giant, you know, this oversized, in this case, human being the center.
That is a thing that I had not put together.
Somewhere in there. So Mark, somebody sent in a question in the chat, so let me read this. So this is from William McLaughlin, I believe. A question for Mark. I like the way you take the stuff of everyday life and make it gently weirder. Have you ever felt the temptation to go beyond this gentle weirdening, good word, and try to write something that's more menacing? Have you ever tried to write something you hoped would deeply scare a reader?
Yes, I have. And thank you, William McLaughlin, for that question. When you get into territory and you start to write a lot or concentrate on some form a lot, you can look around at the other possibilities out there, and definitely one that is like sort of unreal. I don't write realism. And there's always something that goes a little bit askew or weird, like you're saying. And some of the options with that, when you're looking to like, where's my new territory, is like, some of it's horror. Some of it is like really scary stuff. And I've dabbled in that. I really like reading some more terrifying work. But when I start to write it, I tend to make myself feel so bad when I write it that I don't think that it's the territory that I should be in. When I start to write something where I'm like, oh, this is going to be super creepy, what I wind up doing is just making something that makes me feel like I am somehow deranged in a way that I don't like. So there's some territory that I know that I need to avoid, because it doesn't excite me. It actually turns me like more inward about, hey, what's going on inside your mind there. I do think that it's incredible when people are able to do it. In thinking about the stuff that, like, say, like, for instance, like Stephen King does with supernatural stuff, and really, really like grotesque horror, there's a bravery or courage or something you got to break through that I do not break through when I'm trying to do that. Like, I always pull back into something much more domestic. I pull back into stuff that I know, and I want to explore the timid world that I basically inhabit.
I don't know if you know Brian Evanson's work at all, but he's somebody who I read and I go like, it's just, there's something in there. He gets into these places that I know what you mean. I like, you worry about it a little bit, you know, you're like, wow, you really broke into a fascinating, really dark area. And he approaches it so subtly too, and teases it out that it is disconcerting, I think, to read. I mean, it's excellent, but disconcerting.
If people can do that, I mean, they have, as I said, just like broken through something that like it is not in me to do. And I think that horror writers, I love reading some of that stuff. I love watching some of that stuff. And it's really odd to find out like where your niche is or like where your boundaries are. And when you experiment with those things and you recoil or you pull back from those are moments that you should basically pay attention to, because in the end, like, you got to be doing something that really excites you and feels like the thing that you should be doing.
I'm curious, that puts me in mind of, you know, genre, I guess, or classification, let's say. And, you know, there's a blurb on back of your book that refers to your writing as fabulism. You know, you have the section experience surreal times, so I'll throw like surrealism in there. maybe absurdism, which is a term that comes to mind. For me, I'm curious, do you think of your writing in any of these specific ways, or what would you most equate it to?
I teach a class called Unreal Literature at Berklee College of Music. And what we do in that class is to sort of figure out, okay, there's realism, which is the dominant prose fiction form. And then there's these things that slip out of fiction that become surreal, absurd, magical, science fiction, fantasy, fairy tale, all of these things. I love exploring that, but each one sort of has its barriers, and there's room to blur them. There's things that fit perfectly into those genres, and those are fun to look at, because it's like, oh, why do we call what just happened surreal in our lives? Oh, well, let's look at this piece, this painting, and this story, and see what surrealism looks like, and we can piece it together. It's dreamlike. What does that mean? Magical realism, complicated term. There's history with it. There's also aesthetic with it. I think with my stuff, all I really know is that when I write things that are 100% realism, which I try to do, or they sometimes come out, they feel flat. They feel like they are lacking something. So for me, I do think of life as truthful outside of the realm of strictly the truth that's happening, like the facts on the ground. I live a lot in my head. I do a lot of imagining. I picture things, and I read a lot of weird stuff, and I watch a lot of weird stuff. We all do. So I think that our lives are actually combined with unrealistic genres. Mine, the one I feel most comfortable with as a title, as like a label on my stuff, is absurdism. Because I do think that with absurdism, what you have is a premise that you can hear and then leave the story. If you're not into it, you can bail on it. But there's room to explore commentary. There's room to get into situations that don't happen in real life, but comment on real life. I love absurdism. And I think that people have called my stuff surrealism or magic realism. And I think with any of those, they are evolutions of something I started as absurd. I saw that there was a possibility to be more dramatic rather than comedic, and that's why they leak into these other forms. But I do maintain that I don't feel comfortable with something that winds up being totally realistic. Maybe someday I will.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, honestly, I think one of your great strengths in the way it works, and almost like a definition, of absurdism in some way, is the idea of having a strange scenario infused with human fallibility. So it's like, if you as a reader, you can buy into the scenario, a giant washes ashore, you're into the story, but it's not going to work until the humans get involved and we see how they start reacting. You have this great line. Oop, we lagged for a second.
The last thing I heard was you were about to compliment me, Peter, which I really want to hear. It was, you have this great line.
Yeah, you have this great line at the end of Giant it's not interesting enough to even hurt us. And I mean, that's such a, there's so much great contradiction in there, but humanity, this truth of excite us and don't hurt us, but also, give us something to keep going with. And I think that's a real strength of your writing. I think that's what makes it work.
And another thing about it is that there's a little bit more room to interpret. It's really great when realism can align and resonate with your experiences. There's something about absurdism or unrealism in another way, where you are able to sort of map onto it the ideas or theories or experiences that you've had, and now you actually take ownership of the story yourself. In that story, the Giant, I think it works to an extent because everybody thinks that everybody knows exactly what it means. Nobody has said the same thing about it. So it seems really obvious to people who read it, but nobody has said what I thought of when I was writing it.
And we'll leave that just hanging in the air. I like the mystery of that. Mark, I'm gonna go. I could talk to you for hours and hours, but that's my time. So I'm going to sign off and thank you very much for being here. I look forward to hearing this last previously unpublished story. And the book is just so fantastic. I'm so glad that BOA could publish it. I'll quickly show the cover, which is also amazing and done by our designer, Sandy Knight. The OK End of Funny Town. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, I think I'm taking the stage again. I am taking back the floor and I'm going to read This Is Scary. This is unpublished, so be forgiving. Also, publish it if you're out there and you're an editor. Okay, this is a story called My Tour of Lies. It is a microfiction. There are some allusions to, or it's probably based on where I currently live, which is Salem, Massachusetts. And here's the story. After this, I'll sign off. The story is called My Tour of Lies. I live in a real heavily visited town, and I give this tour. I do it for walking around money. I have a job. That's not my point. There are a ton of other tours because like 100 years ago or something, this genuinely screwy thing happened. All these people died all at one time in a nutty ritual death sacrifice thing. So now the town has these laws about preserving history, which means that no one can renovate anything. Everywhere there's like a knickknack shop or an ice cream parlor with some cutesy name that references the suicides of our history. People come from all over and they buy the hats that the people in the town wore when they offed themselves together. That's another thing. The hats look really uncomfortable. They look like, think of a pirate's hat and then swoop and fold it around your lips and then in. The hats were made of pressed maize, so they were super rigid. Now, the shops sell replicas made of cotton. And the spout at the very top, where the poison went in and then oozed down into their mouths, killing them, is made of plastic. But I don't sell hats. The first thing I tell folks on my tour is to look down. The cobblestones have been here for centuries. That's not the lie. I want them to see something more than just cobblestones. I want them to see our ancestors walking on the cobblestones, to hear the clip-clop of horses, in the rattling of carriages, so much of time to which these cobblestones have been witness. I tell them, look closer, listen. Now, all you can hear are car horns or radio stations leaking out from open doors or of the tourist shops. Some kid shouting, "Mom, watch, Mom, look." Sometimes you can hear the same sound of a rush of wind and a fluttering of dresses that they heard 100 years ago. That's not the lie. Eventually, everyone gets fussy and wants to see the spot of the ritual mass suicide thing, and I get it. When I first moved here, I wanted to see the spot as well. I walked them through the alley behind my favorite sushi place, over the parking lot, toward the harbor. The town does a really nice job with the historic spot. I've been to other landmarks in other towns, and you just don't feel anything. It's sad. Luckily, in our town, we have a fairly arty citizenry, and so there's care put into it. The exact spot is in a field that extends down to the piers. It's ringed with tulips, and there's a plaque. Without fail, a few folks always wander over to the plaque, but I tell them, don't read it until you've experienced it for yourself. I gesture with love for them to join us, and they do. Wordlessly, I grab the hand of the person to my right, and then demonstrably, I grab and lift up the hand of the person to my left and wait until everyone gets it and holds hands. I take a deep breath and step over the flower beds, leading my tour group into the spot that we all wanted to see. Once we are inside, I bow my head and close my eyes and try, really try, but no one can remember why they did it. And that is the end of that story. My tour of lies. Which one was the lie? And I believe that is it from here. I will hand it back over. Thank you everybody for coming to this. I had a great time. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Writers and Books.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for sharing your work with us tonight. Thank you to Peter Connors. You can buy the OK End of Funnytown at Ampersand Books. And please join us next week for Tuesdays with BOA. We'll have the poet Catherine Nurnberger reading from her new book, Rue. So thanks for coming, and have a good night.